We're excited. We're excited to be part of what we expect will be an uplifting event. We think we could all use a little positivity these days. I'm Margaret Keith, and this is my partner, Jim Brophy. And this gathering is sponsored by the Council of Canadians, Windsor Essex Chapter and Windsor on Watch, which are located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people of the Three Fires Confederacy, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa. We recognize that all of Canada resides on traditional unceded and or treaty lands of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and we are grateful for their ongoing care, respect, and love of the land, air, and water that we now share. You can got it here. So we'd also like to take this opportunity to recommit ourselves to the struggle against the systems of oppression that have dispossessed Indigenous people of their ancestral lands and denied their rights to self-determination. And we endeavor to actively support the calls to action put forward by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we're planning to keep tonight's event to an hour. You'll have a chance to ask Maude questions in writing via the chat. We do suggest that you resist from making comments in the chat. It can be a bit distracting, but feel to write in your questions as they come to you, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Also, we're recording this event and we hope to have it up on YouTube within a week. Jim?
Thanks, Mark. Tonight, we have the pleasure of speaking, having a conversation, with Maude Barlow. We always cherish the opportunity to speak with her, but Maude's recent book, Still Hopeful, Lessons from a Life of Activism, has provided an opportune moment to facilitate a timely conversation. It is unlikely that anyone engaged in the broad social justice movements in Canada over the last 4 decades would not know Maude Barlow. Her range of activism included participating in movements to enhance women's equality, defend workers against global capitalism, break with Canada's colonial oppression of First Nations, and empower the environmental justice movement to sustain the earth and preserve its resources so that they might be available to everyone and not just the rapacious multinational corporations. Her brilliance and emotional warmth are often extended into working class communities like Windsor. Her energy and optimism help to rejuvenate our enthusiasm and commitment. One of the last times Maude came to Windsor, she spoke with high school students about human rights. And then later that day, in an act of solidarity, symbolically brought water to our Detroit sisters and brothers whose own water had been turned off by merciless government officials. The following morning, Maude participated in a bus trip to Sarnia with American and Canadian activists to join Aamjiwnaang environmental advocates as they led a tour of their community. It is not uncommon for her to engage in such triathlons. If Pat Noonan, one of our local and most beloved social justice heroes, were here tonight, she would tell us that her treasured friend, Maude Barlow, needs no introduction. So without further delay, we warmly welcome Maude.
Well, thank you so much, Margaret and Jim. And you are not only old friends, but two people I deeply admire. Thank you to Randy for the work you've done putting this together. Thank you to Anne and to Philippa, who's a new friend. Big shout out to Doug, who's long-term a friend and colleague at the council. And I think we may have Marion Overholt on the call. So a big hug to you, Marion, virtual hug to you. So I'm just delighted to be here. So what got me thinking about writing about hope? Well, part of it was the pandemic, and we were all kind of in that space thinking about what it means and what can we learn from going through something like this. But I was at an event at a big old church in Glebe, downtown Ottawa, in the June of 2019 with David Suzuki and Avi Lewis and a number of people. on the Green New Deal, and there were tons of young people. It was the church was packed. It holds 700 or 800 people, and it was packed. They were turning them away. A lot of them were young people. And it was just a time people were feeling really betrayed by governments and this and that. And one way or another, the messages coming from the talks, from the presenters, was really the end of the world kind of thing, 10 years left of a good, of a healthy planet, and, the sixth grade extinction and stuff. And I could see people in the audience, So I got up and spoke about hope and the things that we're doing, Blue communities and the Green New Deal and others, and about the need for action and so on. And when we got into a debate afterwards, people saying, well, you've got to face facts and so on. But it was really interesting. Two young high school women, I would say grade 12, came up afterwards and they were in tears. And one said, if you hadn't talked about hope, I don't know that I ever would have come back to anything like this again. It was my first ever, right? And my own granddaughter, who was 16 at the time, she's 20 now, was there as well. And I really got a gauge of that need for realistic hope to talk to young people. So, because I worry that the feeling of hopelessness that can come over us when you see the world and the things that we're all worried about can leave you feeling that the situation itself is hopeless. And that's not true. And that's the most important message we can tell ourselves and each other, and particularly young people. So I came up with a definition of hope going through writing this book. It's not kind of till the end that I came up with a definition I felt comfortable with. But to me, hope is the commitment to protect all that is good for the future generations and the planet, knowing that you can't control the outcome. And for a type A like me, that's really hard, right? Like, I got my dates, I want this law changed, and we're going to do this and this and this, and I don't get to make those decisions, right? So knowing you can't change or control the outcome, but you put your hand out anyway, and you touch the universe where you can, and you, in a way that you can make a difference, and you have faith that others are doing the same. And you don't know who they are. You can't possibly know out of 8 billion whatever people in the world who's doing what. You have to have faith that you're not alone. And that's the definition I came out with it at the end. And so I just want to sort of quickly go through the three kind of major lessons that came from writing this book. First of all is the need to define hope properly. And we're not talking about Pollyanna-ish hope where everything's fine and you don't have to do anything. In fact, it has a lot, and that kind of optimism has a lot in common with pessimism, which is you don't have to do anything, right? I borrowed a term called wise hope from an American spiritual leader named Joan Halifax. This is a woman who, among other things, works with men on death row. So she has something to say interesting about hope. And she defines it very, very clearly. Wise hope faces reality. It's not asking you not to deal with or face what we're dealing with. It requires engagement, even in spite of the overwhelming information that we're given. It welcomes grief, but not despair. And I want to take a minute on that because I think it's an extremely important distinction. I quote Clarissa Pinkola Estes, who's a psychoanalyst and a poet, who says, I feel despair. Of course I do. But she says, and I love this, I do not set a place for it at my table. She actively understands that despair leads to dead ends. It leads to a door that's closed. She says, we are needed. That is all we can know. It is not given to us to know which acts or by whom will cause the critical mass to tip towards an enduring good. David Suzuki says, embrace the grief. In fact, you have to find a place for it. And he even says you have to find a place for it in organizations. And I think about things I might do differently going back 30 years, founding organizations that I've been involved with and maybe carving out that space for grief. He says, don't rush past the feelings. He says, use these emotions to summon the courage to experience our sadness together, using that to come together in the best that humanity has to offer. And that notion of separating grief, which is a necessary process, from despair, which leads to a dead end, is really important. It's hard work to build a just society. It's hard work to build policy based on good science. It's hard work to build true democracy. It's one of the messages I give to young people whenever I speak to them. Sorry, you think it's all wrapped up, you got that, and that's all, you put that in the oven, you don't need to worry about it. No, it comes back in different forms. Every generation has to fight for democracy. Maybe it looks different, but every generation has to fight for justice, human rights, and democracy, again, in their own way. We who are privileged enough to have some security from violence in our work and our lives, and I'm not saying that's everyone in Canada by a long shot, but I read about the dissident in Russia today who was given 25 years for not disagreeing with Russian policy. And, you know, we who don't face that have, in my opinion, a responsibility to bear witness to the suffering of others. And when I hear, you know, these privileged PhD students at Ivy League universities or, you know, wonderful top universities saying, oh, it's all too late and I can't be bothered and there's nothing to be done. And I think, no, you don't have the right to do that. That's privilege times 20, times thousands. It's not good. Wise hope requires complete attachment to the struggle, but a detachment from a preordained outcome. This is what you want to happen, but if you think you can control that, you're going to, first of all, you think too much of yourself, and secondly, you're going to set yourself up for a fall, because you will be so upset when you don't get what you want. I quote Vandana Shiva, the great Indian physicist and food sovereigntist, and she says she's learned never to let herself be overwhelmed by hopelessness, no matter how tough the situation. I'll quote from her. She says, the content is not in your control, but your commitment is yours to make. And you can make the deepest commitment with total detachment about where it will take you. You want it to lead to a better world, and you shape your actions and take full responsibility for them. But then you have to have detachment. And that combination of deep passion and deep compassion allows me always to take the next challenge, because I don't tie myself up in knots. That's wonderful self-help language. Wise hope says that when you're overwhelmed, you stop and you say, what is the next appropriate step to take? And you take it. And I think about Greta Thunberg when she first learned about the climate crisis. She was 11 years old. She was a little girl. She lost a bunch of like 20 pounds or something. She wasn't big to begin with. And she went to her room for 2 years. She quit school. She wouldn't come downstairs. She went into a deep, deep, deep depression. And she said the day she got up and walked down to the Parliament building in Stockholm, her capital, and sat and did something, the despair, the despondency, the anxiety, and the depression lifted. And she said, hope is action, action is hope. She had no way of knowing she was going to lead to a youth movement, international youth movement. But it was that action. It was taking action in the face of not knowing what you're going to accomplish, but knowing you have to do it. So that's kind of big lesson one. The second lesson is learning from the past and going back into other times of other crisis, because every crisis shakes up the existing social order and opens a way for true change, but it also opens a way for a fight back, which we're seeing right now coming out of the pandemic and the convoy conspiracy craziness and the kind of anti-intellectual, anti-education, anti-science conspiracy type theories that we're seeing. That's a fight back against the knowledge of what we all learned from, or we hope we started to learn from going through the pandemic. But I look back to the Second World War in the book, because so horrible, of course, as many as 85 million people died. And of course, nothing as awful as the Holocaust. So can anything have come out of that could be considered good? Well, the first of all of the human rights framework came out of that war. The 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, the creation of the United Nations, of course, the covenants that came right through the notion of social rights, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which takes the whole concept of rights further into cultural rights, community rights, rights over local resources. Like we've progressed even since that language of 1948. We've progressed incredibly with that kind of language. So I think that the climate crisis and the pandemic crises, the pandemic we're coming out of, the climate, of course, we're not out of at all yet. They exposed the deep inequalities that decades of economic globalization and deregulation and privatization of social services and the deregulation of the environment and so on, cuts to education, cuts to social security, cuts to healthcare. It exposed what that meant. And it's really interesting. I went into institutions like the WTO and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and they're admitting that the pandemic showed that it's bankrupt, this notion of economic globalization and supply chains, and you'll build all of A and you'll build all of B and you'll build all of C. It just didn't work because it's all based on the profit motive. So what profit is there in getting vaccines to people in the global south? It's not going to be done by capitalism. It's not going to be done by these large for-profit transnational corporations. And I would remind us that of the 100 largest economies in the world, 69 are transnational corporations. Only 31 are countries. Just, let that sink in kind of thing. It's just, we transferred so much power over to the private sector through the 1980s, 1990s, the first decade of this century, in the name of economic globalization, and we're just crawling out from under that now. But there is a moment now to say that didn't work. We had a huge conference a month ago, not quite a month ago, in New York City on water, the first UN conference on water since 1977, if you can believe it. But what the language that came out of it was just startling, talking about water as a common good. Nobody was arguing anymore that it's not a human right. They talked about the hydrologic cycle being a global commons. A statement put out by the OECD, which is all the rich countries basically coming together to get them more rich, basically talked about the global hydrologic cycle being a global commons. I mean, this is what? Somebody said they sound like you, Maude. And I'm not fooled. I know we're still dealing with all of that, but there was an understanding and an admission that this isn't working. It's not working for the climate crisis, and the system did not work when we had this pandemic. And it's a moment for something new to be built. And I guess the third major lesson that came out for me is the need to understand how important it is to build a movement. Take the long-term view. We are building social change, and it doesn't come overnight, and it's not based on one campaign. It's not about winning one cause or one campaign. It's about building sustainable momentum. It's about building democracy. It's important to have goals and plans and timetables and communication tools. We do all that in the movements that we have, but we mustn't be rigid. Change can come upon us in ways we didn't anticipate. I quote the wonderful Rebecca Solnit from her book, Hope in the Dark. And by the way, if you haven't read her book, Orwell's Roses, I recommend it. Anyway, that's an aside. She says, we cannot know what will make the difference. She says this, and I'll quote, she says, yes, the world is dark, but as in inscrutable, not necessarily terrible, but many take this fear of unknowability into the fulfillment of their dread. Far stranger things have happened, she says, than the end of the world. The world is wilder than our imagination, says Solnit. Causes and effects assume history marches forward. But history is not an army. It is a crab scuttling sideways, a drip of soft water wearing away stone, an earthquake, breaking centuries of tradition. Sometimes one person inspires a movement, or her words do decades later. Sometimes a few passionate people start a mass movement. Sometimes those millions are stirred by the same outrage and the same ideal, and change comes upon us like the change in weather. So I think about that when I wrote one of the chapters is about my involvement in the second stage, what they call second stage feminism, the second stage of the women's movement, the first being the fight of the modern times, the fight for the vote and so on. and now into a new phase. But you know, the couple of years before my mother was born, the Dominion Elections Act, just before the Canada Elections Act was created, said no person, no woman, idiot, lunatic, or criminal shall vote. You know, so that changed in the lifetime of one generation of women, my mother's generation. It profoundly changed. Yes, there are still many, many, many issues that women are dealing with, but my goodness, we did change the issues around women, like a change in weather. When I was growing up in Ottawa in the 1950s and 60s, my mother couldn't get a driver's license, a travel visa, or open a bank account without my father's permission or signature or whatever. Now, you know, of course he would do everything. I adored my mother, but you know, that it's changed. And when I say that to my granddaughters, they think, Grandma, are you 500 years old? Like, you know, how did that happen? So our movement, and it's more than just that the women's movement changed lives of women. So many change. We made such profound changes, and I think that we took our desire to speak our truth to power into other movements, the environmental movement, the human rights movements, and so on. The whole concept of ecofeminism and so on, because we decided early on we didn't want half the pie. We wanted to change the ingredients. We didn't want to keep everything the way it was, but just, you know, make sure we got our half and our money from it. And we understood the need to make our movements inclusive and diverse. And this can be really tough, speaking of movements. And I just want to quote to you, I quote from Rex Weiler. He's an elder with Greenpeace, and he wrote a lovely letter to young people about building movements. And I just wanted to quote him, because he says, we need to understand that differences may remain unresolved, and that's okay. That's part of the process. We build diversity by abstaining from superficial virtue signaling and abandoning the expectation that all dispute or controversy can be easily resolved. And I'll quote him. He says, part of quieting our ego is the work of shedding the desire to be correct or to make others wrong. Building deep diversity is the art of being at peace with multiple opinions and holding contradictory ideas and ideals in our consciousness with patience and compassion. I think that's just gorgeous writing. And then there's another theme that kept coming through this movement building when I wrote, and that is the issue of kindness or lack thereof. We need to be kinder to each other in our movements and to ourselves. It is a sadness for me to watch the lack of kindness, the blaming, the infighting in so many of our organizations. And I do understand it. I think often it's because it's too big to take that on, but I can take you on. You know, you're not pure enough, or you said the wrong thing the other day. And so we take on each other instead of you know, trying to find those areas where we build movement. I quote a book called On Kindness by historian Barbara Taylor and psychoanalyst Adam Phillips, who say that Western culture sees kindness as a weakness. Except in your family, you're allowed to be kind to family members, but other than that, it's common in current social discourse to express hate. Well, you all know that. We're all watching politicians, particularly women or women journalists and so on, women in public life in particular, just getting viciously hammered online, you know, because of the anonymity that you're allowed to keep. But we need to talk about this and building care and kindness into our lives and into our movements. I think in a world that's all about competition, I'm sorry, that competition comes into our movements as well. And we have to say that and find ways to talk about it. So just in the few minutes that I have left, I just want to say there are so many signs of hope. And I guess that's what one of the major themes that I wanted to come through with the book is that, yes, we have a lot to do, but if you're just kind of learning about the global climate crisis or the global water crisis or whatever, you might think there's no hope or nobody's done anything. Not true, not true. Since we got the United Nations to recognize the human rights to water and sanitation in 2010, over 4 dozen countries have either amended their constitution or brought in a separate law to recognize the human rights to water. There are well over 300 municipalities in the world that have reversed their privatization of water services and gone back to public ownership, public control of their water services. Finally, they're starting to talk about it in England, where Margaret Thatcher started the whole damn thing back in the 80s. But big cities like Berlin and Paris just said it wasn't working. They were gouging people. Quality was terrible and so on. We launched, as you know, the Blue Communities Project, where municipalities pledged to protect water as a human right and a public trust, no privatization, and to phase out plastic bottled water and so on. We now have 25 million people living in official blue community cities in the world. Tons on climate I go into in the book. I know where we are, and I know that the war, the horrible invasion of Ukraine and what's happening has put everything on hold. I understand that. But I would argue that the world has never been more prepared than we are now with what we know and the understanding of building towards this, that we must not give up on this movement. There are many new treaties down the pike on coal, on methane, on plastics, on biodiversity restoration. There's a tsunami of treaties and pledges that are very, very exciting. And I go into and an understanding that we need to shift financial commitments from fossil fuel subsidies to biodiversity protection. It's really important. In Canada, we've signed the 30 by 30 pledge, 30 to protect the biodiversity of the ecosystems of 30% of our country and the waters, pledged to plant 2 billion trees and so on. There are major commitments internationally. A Canadian named David Boyd, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Environment and Human Rights, has led a fight to, and it was a fight, a campaign to get the United Nations to recognize the right to a healthy environment. And that only happened about, I don't know, 6 weeks ago. Did you read about it anywhere? Not in the mainstream Canadian media, but it happened and it's exciting. The rights of nature, I belong to a group called the Global Alliance on the Rights of Nature, very exciting work. Up in northern Quebec, the local Innu First Nation has led a campaign and brought in all the local municipalities to have the Magpie River given rights as a legal entity, not only the right for this mighty river which flows into the St. Lawrence, not only for this river to have the right to exist, to be healthy, not to have deleterious materials dumped into it and so on. The river has the right to sue governments and corporations if they violate the rights. And of course, it's through the Innu caregivers, the caretakers, and so on. And in Canada, finally, we are dealing with this terrible issue of lack of water in First Nations communities. They've restored about 80%, 85%, I guess now, of all of the communities that did not have the water services, the communities that did not have them. And they're due within about 2 years to finish that. Most of the provinces, with the exception of 3, I think, have totally done away with the boil water advisories. So should never have happened in the first place. I'm not arguing that, but we part of reconciliation is knowing that was really important. And our government has signed UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So, you know, movement is there. I write in the book, and I don't have time here to go into it deeply, but I write about what I call towards an earth and human-centered economy. There's a lot of excitement around alternative thinking to the notion of unlimited growth, more stuff, more trees taken down, more rivers polluted, more just all based on the GDP having to go up. And I write about Kate Raworth. I would suggest to you learning about her wonderful work. She's a British economist, and she wrote a book on the donut economy. So the outer ring of this donut are 9 ecological limits of the Earth's life support system that must not be overshot. And then the inner ring are 12 essentials for life, so including food, water, health, social equality that must be met. And then she talks about the sweet spot, the donut, in between the outer ring and the inner ring. And that forms a new way of looking at the economy. It's not straight up growth, but an understanding that, of course, there will be there, things will be made and so on. It's not, we're not walking backward, but that there's a different way of looking at it. And the city of Amsterdam has adopted donut economy for the next 100 years. And the city of Nanaimo here in Canada is looking at the same. So I'm just going to close because I see it's going on 7:30 and I want to give us a half an hour to chat. With just a couple of last thoughts. Clearly, many changes are still needed. I'm not suggesting for a moment they're not. And I have been part of the sounding the alarm, certainly on the waterfront and on economic globalization. But it's really important that we know that many things are happening and that we want to be part of it. And we want young people to feel there's a place for them. I just can't say strongly enough how important that is. Many of us have lost our relationship with nature. It's very easy to happen living in a big city with everything available to you here. And I worry about the billions of kids in inner cities around the world who haven't seen a bird really, or been outside or smelled clean air or touched clean water. And it's hard to relate to nature when you haven't had that experience. So I know I'm speaking to the converted here when I say that we need to listen to the voices of Indigenous peoples and their teachings, and those who have mastered the art of living on the earth without destroying it. So I'm just going to end with two quotes that I love. There's so many. I found so many gorgeous things that people have said about hope. The book's full of them, but here's two. One is Robin Wall Kimmerer. A number of you, I bet, have read her book. She's a biology professor at New York State University, and she's the author of a book called Braiding Sweetgrass. And she says, we have to polish the art of seeing. This means listening to plants and heeding the lessons of the natural world. What would it be like to live in that heightened sensitivity to the lives given for ours? To consider the tree in the Kleenex, the algae in the toothpaste, the oaks in the floor, the grapes in the wine, to follow back the thread of life in everything and pay it respect. Once you start, it's hard to stop, and you begin to feel yourself awash in gifts. Isn't that gorgeous? And then the very last quote is a lovely poet, the poet laureate of Washington. He's very involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, and his name is E. Ethelbert Miller. And he says this: place your heart in your hands and blow gently, spread love like seeds. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Maude. That was wonderful. And I have to say, if anybody hasn't read your book yet, I heartily recommend it. There's so much fruitful thought there. And just to pick up on some of the things you've just been talking about, and especially a couple of minutes ago, you mentioned the need for the connection to nature to be improved. Well, we have a very hopeful story here, right here and on our doorsteps in Windsor. I don't know if you saw today's newspaper, but there was an announcement. There was a huge media event this morning at Ojibwe Shores, or at least at the Ojibwe Nature Center. We are going ahead with the next stage of planning Canada's second national urban park. And that's going to be a fantastic way for, I can see Bob is clapping his hands. It's really going to be a fantastic way for young people, old people, everybody to connect with nature without having to travel a long distance, and for species at risk to recover. And just to go back to the history of this is a story that's several decades in the making. Actually, some people say that it goes back to, I think, 1892 was when it was first mentioned. But I got involved over a decade ago, and at that time it looked like it was completely hopeless. So we've gone from the Port Authority wanting to develop the last little stretch of undeveloped land along the Detroit River to it now being, it is going to be protected in perpetuity for future generations. So this speaks exactly to, to the points that you were making about your definition of hope. This is going to be protected forever, and everybody, stakeholders at all levels of government are now finally totally involved and on board. So we're very excited about that. And that's not to say that everything, I know that's fantastic, right? It's not to say that everything is great, because there are many, many things that we can be very critical about here in Windsor, Essex. Many of you here, I know you all from our court challenge, or our challenge of the decision makers on the mega hospital. They're closing down both of our hospitals and building a new one on farmland outside the city, and we've been trying to get that overturned. And at the moment, that looks like that's a done deal. But I take heart from your words. Instead of being overwhelmed by the enormity of the challenge, we should ask what is the next most appropriate step to take. And it's not over, because what's happening in Ojibwe, I think, is a lesson for all environmental movements. So that's enough from me.
But thank you for sharing that. That's fabulous.
It really is good news.
And congratulations.
Yeah. We got a question from Patty, and she, oh, now I just have to scroll. Just a second. Patty asked, will you be traveling to give talks again? And could you share your reading list, please? And I'm wondering, with a reading list, that might be something that we could share in writing with, you know, with all the participants afterwards. I don't know how you feel about that, Maude.
Well, the question around traveling, I'm doing less of it, of course, being 75 now, and not having the council, not being involved with the council in the same way. So, for instance, with this book, I didn't go on a book tour with the council. I did some individuals, and some were online and some were in person. So, but no, I won't be doing the same, you know, traveling to all those major cities in Canada on a fairly regular basis. Probably not as much, although I'm off to Toronto tomorrow. As I say that, I realize that it's not quite true either. The University of St. Michael's University College is becoming a Blue community on Wednesday. I'm really excited about that. So we've got the certificate all ready to go and so on. And then when I come back for a few days, I'm off to Zurich for the University of Zurich's giving me an honorary doctorate, which is lovely. Then I'm going to do a tour in Switzerland. So even if, as I say, I'm slowing down, it doesn't feel like it, but I'm trying to be a little more retired, I guess. The books that I referred to during my talk, they're all in the book that I wrote. I don't have a reading list per se. I suppose it's a good idea to think to put it together. I'm always sort of saying to people, have you read this? Have you read that kind of thing? But I haven't done anything formal. But everything I referred to here is, except Orwell's Roses. That's not in the book. Orwell's Roses is a wonderful book by Rebecca Solnit. She's a scholar, has studied everything Orwell's written, plus all his private papers. And she is convinced that he grounded himself and his political vision in nature. And it saved him from some bad decisions and some bad advice that he might have given people instead. And he'd be writing something really important, and it would be, you know, deeply important. And then he'd say, damn, the hedgehogs are into my turnips again, you know. So she talks about the roses that he loved, and how grounding ourselves in the earth and in loving nature is so important for the work that we do. So anyway, it's a lovely book. That's the only one that isn't in that book. So
we do have a question from our group Windsor on Watch. We have been grappling with, I mean, you talked about the ugliness, the need to be kind. You know, we're coming out of the past 3 years, and the world is very divided. There's a lot of ugly talk, and I feel that in a lot of the time people are not even talking to each other, they're talking across each other, and I find it very disturbing. All of us in the group find it very disturbing, and we'd like your advice on, you know, how to change that. And I understand, you know, you be kind, I guess, listen to other points of view, but maybe you have some further comments on how
Oh,
can
yeah.
we.
And please understand, I'm not saying be kind to those who are, white supremacists or whatever. That's not my
Yeah.
point at all. I'm more was referring to working within our movements, to one another and to yourself. Because self-healing and self-care is really important, because we can burn out. In terms of dealing with the right-wing backlash, the right-wing populism that we're dealing with, it's very disturbing. I'm very disturbed by Pierre Poilievre. I think he's a dangerous man. He's going after the CBC now, and there's a terrific meme where he's spraying on the CBC building, government funded. And this little kid says, "But who pays your salary?" Which is like, and he doesn't want to think about that. But I find him, I live in Ottawa, and I'm down in the red zone, what they call the red zone, where the convoy was last year for 3 weeks. And it was awful. Like, they were awful. Like, there was no kindness in my heart, I have to tell you, for the people who were there honking 24 hours, 7 days a week, throwing people down in the snow if they had a mask on, defecating on the tomb of the unknown soldier. Like, there was no kindness in my heart for that. How we deal with that is a very difficult set of questions for us to ask. We need to get to young people. I've been watching the convoy people have gone from fighting for freedom around vaccines now to going after LGBTQ, the drag queen library readings, and anything trans. That's their new thing. And they've recruited these young people. They are kids. They're high school kids, and they're standing outside of these events in the name of God with their red caps, and selling or giving away Bibles, and in the name of God attacking all the human rights that we kind of thought that's what I said earlier, kind of dusted off and put in the oven. It's finished, like that's done, right? No, it's not. So we need to find ways to have a dialogue, because I think we're the souls of these young people, the hearts and souls are kind of up for grabs right now, because it's a very interesting and easy path to go down here. The algorithms are going to send you down there. And last thing to say on this, I read a very interesting analysis by a doctor who described how some doctors and scientists are going down that other path, the conspiracy path, and people with good reputations and highly educated and doing good work. Well, you've got a website, or you've got a blog or whatever, and you're writing about vaccines, and then you write about somebody who says maybe that ivermectin, whatever you call it, that horse medicine, maybe that's okay. And suddenly you go from 20 people following you to 300, and then you give it a little more credence, and all of a sudden you've got 1,000 followers, and you go a little bit further and you start to go down that path, and all of a sudden you've got potentially millions of followers. You get advertisers, you get brought on TV to speak about this, and you've given up that other career of being respected as a doctor or a scientist, but you've entered that world. And I think we need to try to understand this phenomenon and the place of the internet, the algorithms which take you from here. If you're questioning this, then it's going to take you here and here and here, and it's going to take you deeper and deeper. And a lot of it is based on anti-women. I am convinced of that, and anti-Semitism. I'm convinced of that. These go deep back into the roots of sexism and racism that come out in different ways. So it's dressed up in new colors, but it's the same issues we've been dealing with. But they have the internet. It's a very powerful tool, and we really need to speak to each other in deep honesty about it. So, but I had no kindness for the convoy people, I have to tell you. I was looking for it, but not finding it.
Well, there's another question that touches on the consequences of this, and it's somebody who says, "I'm so glad I tuned in. This was wonderful. Thank you. In Windsor's last municipal election, only 30% of our eligible vote voted. Our sitting mayor is in his seat with only 16% of the vote. Would you please speak to voter apathy?"
Well, I'd love to hear what other people say, because I'm not the person who has all the answers here. So I would love to open this up and hear what others have to say. I mean, Marion, I'd love you to jump in. I mean, yes, it's a problem. Look at Doug Ford. Who voted for him? Like, how did that happen? Did you vote for privatized education? Did you vote for cuts to healthcare? Did you vote for him selling off the seniors' residences? Did you vote for him destroying all the conservation authorities? Is that what you voted for? It goes hand in hand, this sort of anti-education, anti-intellectual, anti-democratic concept, the common people sort of thing that Pierre Poilievre speaks to. All those experts, why do you think they know something that you know just as much as they do? And it's very tempting. It's a very tempting way to think. But I'm working with a group of wonderful, wonderful teachers. We're building a new project called Blue Schools Network, which I think people are going to love. And it's basically similar to the Blue Communities, but it's for teachers who are teaching kids from from kindergarten to K to 12 on water, on the need to protect water, on the connection between water and climate, how climate impacts water, but vice versa, on the human right to water, and around plastics and the whole issue of plastics and so on. And when I meet these teachers, I think, oh, they're the hope. We need to get to these kids at a very young age, when they're young and their minds are clear and clean, right? You can inspire them. And they're ready. I was with one group of kids. They were like kindergarten to grade 4. Some of them even came in into the gym on the little ropes, right? I said, now, does anybody know why we have concern with plastic bottles, of water? I thought maybe nobody would put their hand up. 400 little kids go, oh, me, miss me. They know, and then what happens? And yeah, we have big social issues, and you get up every day and you take a deep breath and you say, how do we change that? That voting is extremely important and extremely disturbing to see those stats.
Yeah.
I would love to hear other people's views, though, not just my own.
I am now seeing questions coming in. I think people have got over their shyness. I don't know if somebody would like to speak. No, I think Cheryl's got her hand up.
Hi, I was going to find the sticker. Thanks, Maude. I think I'm just going to delve right into it. You touched on some of it when you were speaking to us. I think we are mistaking for apathy something that is more like people are overwhelmed and the despair. They just don't feel like they can respond and be a responsible voter. I feel like this community engagement and just taking on small things that are nonpartisan is extremely important, because I have been partisan. I believe that we're also in a hyper-partisan environment that the social media has exacerbated. So all of our scholarly and intellectual arguments and insights about a first past the post system, it's allowed social media, the algorithms, the sensationalism, that winner take all, has been allowed to devolve our system even faster. And I meet people all the time who are very like-minded in social justice issues and how they apply to federal policy, but they feel like, I can't be a part of this corporate agenda. I can't do it. And I'm just going to go to ground. I'm going to start a native garden, and I'm not going to think about that stuff. And it's sincere. They're not being sarcastic or, oh, everybody's, out to lunch except for me. They're hurting from it, that there's a real despair that I thought of immediately when you were speaking. I was thinking about this voter apathy. I would love for us to find another word that really conveys this this empathy that a lot of people have makes them have to protect themselves or harden themselves or put themselves in a bubble for self-preservation.
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that.
No, I could not agree more. Thank you so much. That is beautifully put. So often you hear people say, what's the point of voting? They're all the same, which isn't true, but they say they're all the same. And what difference does my vote make? And I'm just going to go off and take care of my family. And it's this kind of, maybe a garden or, so, a native, you're doing something good, but that you are, disconnecting from society because you feel unable to do anything about it. I think that is absolutely true. And even when I joke about not having kindness towards the convoy, I do think a lot of the people of that movement are loners. They're not happy people. They're not perhaps the most successful in the world. And they found each other and they found a community. So they walk down the street screaming freedom, freedom, freedom. But really, I've also watched the videos around them. They hug each other and there's a sense of family and there's a sense of having found each other in some kind of purpose. Because if you ask one, what are you for or against, it's different than the next one would say, right? But they did find that sense of community, and building democracy is damn hard work. But I love your notion about getting involved in projects that are nonpartisan, are about the community good and making people feel I did that. I made a difference. Maybe I can do it again, or maybe I can do that plus something else. Yeah, that's the movement. Those are the movements we build. Thank you.
I have, there's a couple of great questions, Ferdinanda and Jane. I don't want to lose track of your questions, but Marion, you've got your hand up, so perhaps we can hear from you now. I don't know if, yeah.
Thanks so much. Maude, just so wonderful to be with you. This whole meeting has just been really inspiring. And I put in the chat that I do feel there's a resurgence of really that grassroots organizing that we feel, that we know is just so critical to any social movement. And I just, and recently I've just been in a couple of conversations and meetings where people are really looking at, how do we fight back and how do we hold up what we all treasure and what we think is worth fighting for. So I do see that resurgence happening, and it's just lovely to be part of that. So good to be with you tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marion. And nobody has done more community work, more grassroots justice organizing than you. And it's just such an honor to have you on and just to send my love to you. And yes, you just don't give up. That's all. You take a break if you need to, go do something else, but come back to it because, it's in our blood in a way. It isn't in me to stand by and let, things happen. And when that's who you are, you have to do it, but you have to do it in a way that is self-caring as well, knowing when to step back. But thank you, Marion.
Thank you.
You look great, by the way.
You
Never give up. Jane asks if you have any thoughts about how to influence the media in the current landscape of social media and shrinking traditional media to pick up the stories of hope while also conveying the urgency of the issues that social justice advocates are working at.
Well, great question. And I know we're coming to our ending, our 8 o'clock. Of course, you all know to support alternative media, the National Observer, Rabble, Tai, there's the Narwhal, there's so many, and they're so important, and they do carry stories, good stories of hope. I read the National Observer quite diligently because I really find that they're doing this. They're highlighting young people who are doing wonderful things, young Indigenous leaders who are doing wonderful climate work or work on water or whatever, and that's really important for us to see. I think the mainstream media is less sure of itself, which is a good thing. It's important to remember that the National Post is owned by a big American investment conglomerate, and they are feeding a nonstop columnists and opinion and editorials on from a right-wing perspective. I mean, you might have lots of reasons not to like Trudeau, but they go after him like insanely. Like it's like he could walk on water and they'd say he was a trick or something. The hatred of everything outside of that bubble and it's, so that's from the National Post. Then the Globe and Mail, of course, is small c conservative. So they are, I don't know what they're going to do in the next election, if they would dare endorse Podevka, but they endorsed Harper, of course, each time. So we don't really have a lot of voices in the mainstream media, and it's very important for us to get these messages out. I was very upset or annoyed that the UN Conference on Water, this is, as I said earlier, the first since 1977, the first time the UN has convened a conference, a gathering on water. 10,000 of us came together in New York City. It was an incredibly important gathering. Did you read about it anywhere? No, you didn't, not even in alternative media in Canada. It's like, that's the old water story. We have so much of it. Well, I call it the myth of abundance. So people didn't need to do anything on it. So it's, again, you take a deep breath and you say, damn it. So I'm actually writing Mac Fawcett. I've got a little started here, an email to Mac Fawcett to say, because he's just started a new blog or some kind of a new newsletter or something, a Substack or something. And he's asking for ideas. And I'm saying, you guys all missed this water story, and it's incredibly important. Did you know that the UN put out a statement just days before the event that within the next decade, the demand for water will outstrip supply by 40%. You know, this, I'm not making this stuff up, right? Like, this is just mind bending to think about what we're dealing with in a planet running out of clean water, and the demand going like this and the supply going like this. You can't make this stuff up. And the bottled water, in spite of all the work that we've done on plastic bottled water, and all the universities have pledged not to supply it anymore, it's going to double within the next 10 years as well. So we've just got huge amounts of work to cut out that are cut out for ourselves. But we need to not give up on the mainstream media. I'm not of the opinion, or to hell with the Globe, and you keep going at them. They're like the IMF and the World Bank and all of those that are realizing the old way didn't work, and something new can be born here. So we just have to have hope and keep at it.
We are at 7:58, and I still have to get to Ferdinanda's question, which I'm very interested in too. She says, and hi, Ferdinanda, she lives just up the road from me. There's a new book, Left is Not Woke. I feel like woke culture is dividing the left. Many of us on the left feel that woke culture is extreme, and others on the left think that it's about time that woke voices were heard. Do you have any comments on that?
Well, the term woke has been picked up by the right to mean everything, to mean more than perhaps those on the left would take exception to, if you see what I mean. For them, woke is anybody caring about racism, sexism, equality issues, LGBTQ plus issues, and so on. And I think on the left, when people talk about that, that's not them. They're not saying that. On the left, I think the distinction is between those who wanted to deal more in what some call identity politics, that other issues have to be put on hold while we deal with those more identity politics, whether they're race or gender or whatever. Whereas many people say, yes, but there's the climate crisis, and we have to come together. And I actually address this, take some time in the book to address this, because I say it can't be either or. We have to hear the voices of those who say, I've been left out. You need to hear me. I have anger, and I have a right to my anger. But we, at the same time, have to find a way to bring those voices. And that's why I quoted Rex Weiler, who says, don't think it's going to be easy, and don't think you're going to solve it right away, because you're not. But bringing those voices into the campaigns that are still deeply, deeply important. So I understand when people say, the woke language, but I think it's the distinction or the debate on the left is different than those on the right who just slam it as, like Trump slams, everything left of himself is woke, which is pretty well everybody in the world, I guess.
That's very eloquently put. There are some wonderful comments here in the chat, and I would love to save them and make sure that you get to see all of them. But we are exactly on time. And so I would like to thank you, Maude, and hand the microphone over to Anne Beer, who's going to take over from here.
Thank you, Philippa.
And you need to unmute yourself.
I have.
Hi, Anne.
Thank you, all of you. Oh, thank you, all of you who have listening, and I'm sure we all feel more energized tonight. The book is available at Biblioasis, by the way. My sad thing is, Maude, or maybe that shows my age. What happened to the anti-war movement? We are in war now. And once again, you hardly hear about it. But we are so grateful that you are able to come somehow talk to us. And we all hope that we might make and meet in person. Thank you so much. And you gave us a lot of hope. Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Sending love.
All right, that ends it. Good night, people. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.